lawn violates HOA standards, and I'm here to enforce the rules.
Karen, stepping onto my property.
And as everybody without permission is trespassing.
The morning Karen decided to trespass onto my lawn began like every other quiet Saturday in our little lakeside neighborhood. The kind of morning where the air smelled like cut grass and the sun painted the water gold. I was halfway through trimming a few overgrown shrubs near the fence line, enjoying the low hum of bees and the distant laughter of kids riding their bikes, when I noticed her figure striding across the cul-de-sac. Karen never just walked anywhere. She patrolled, hips swaying like a metronome of self-importance, her oversized sunglasses catching the light like warning beacons. Tucked under her arm, predictably, was her ever-present clipboard, the symbol of her self-appointed reign as HOA president. She was the type of neighbor who'd count your dandelions, measure the angle of your mailbox post, and remind you of every obscure bylaw that hadn't been enforced in years. Most people endured her with polite smiles and quick nods, whispering their real opinions once she was out of earshot. But today, she wasn't content to hover on the sidewalk. Without so much as ringing the doorbell or calling ahead, she stepped right through my front gate and began marching across my lawn like she owned IT. IT wasn't the first time she'd nitpicked my property, but something about the brazen way she crossed my flower beds sent a flash of irritation through me. The audacity was breathtaking. To Karen, rules only mattered when they applied to other people. She'd fine a neighbor for leaving a trash can out overnight, but park her SUV blocking the fire hydrant just for a minute without a second thought. As she stomped over the grass, I couldn't help thinking about how she'd recently hassled the Martins over their bird feeder being too decorative and bullied old Mr. Benson into repainting his shutters because they weren't HOA-approved beige. Her power was fear. She knew most people hated confrontation, so they quietly complied rather than risk her wrath. But as she bent over to scrutinize a patch of my grass near the fence, I felt the balance of power shift. For weeks, Karen had been sending passive-aggressive reminders about lawn uniformity standards, implying that my yard, a perfectly healthy, if slightly eclectic, mix of native grasses and wildflowers, was dragging down property values. I'd ignored her notes, confident that my lawn was well within HOA regulations, even double-checking the bylaws to be sure. My wife, Emily, had laughed it off when I showed her the latest memo, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear and reminding me not to let Karen ruin a perfectly good weekend. Emily had a way of grounding me, sharp-minded, calm, with a quiet confidence that came from years of practicing law. She'd spent her career dismantling arrogant blowhards in courtrooms, and Karen, she joked, was just another one with a clipboard instead of a gavel. Still, seeing Karen's sandals pressing into my flower bed stirred something more defiant in me that I stayed still for a moment, letting her think she was unobserved. She crouched, poked at the soil with a pen, and muttered something to herself as she scribbled notes. The scene would have been comical if it weren't so invasive. This wasn't about grass or flowers anymore. It was about control. Karen had built her little empire on intimidation, and now she'd crossed a line. What she didn't realize was that the line she'd stepped over wasn't just a property boundary. It was a legal one. And what she really didn't know, the detail that would undo her carefully constructed authority, was that my wife was not only a skilled attorney, but one who specialized in property and civil law. Karen thought she was auditing a lawn. In reality, she was walking straight into a trap of her own, making .as she straightened, glancing toward my porch like she expected me to come out groveling. I began to mentally catalog every petty infraction she herself had committed. The unapproved patio extension she built last spring without submitting plans. The noise complaints she ignored when she hosted late-night parties. Even the HOA funds she suspiciously allocated for beautification projects that always seemed to benefit her own property first. The hypocrisy was staggering. The more I thought about it, the more a plan began to take shape, not out of spite, but out of a long-simmering sense of justice. I'd watched her humiliate too many of my neighbors, watched her wield her clipboard like a sword, and now she had handed me the perfect opportunity to stand up. The first step was patience. Emily always said bullies defeat themselves if you let them overreach. Karen was doing just that, and I wasn't about to stop her. Later that day, as Emily and I sat on the porch sipping coffee, I described Karen's uninvited inspection. Emily listened quietly, her brow furrowing slightly. She asked for specifics, exactly where Karen had stepped, what she'd done, and whether she'd documented anything. When I told her Karen had poked around with a pen and scribbled notes, Emily's lips curved into a knowing smile. She didn't raise her voice or jump to action. She simply said she trespassed, and if she files a complaint, she's just admitted to it in writing. That simple statement sent a thrill of anticipation through me. Karen thought she had the upper hand, but in that moment, I realized she had just handed us the leverage we needed. What started as a petty HOA squabble was about to escalate into something far bigger, a battle of wits and rules that Karen couldn't win. And deep down, I knew the neighborhood was watching. Even if they pretended not to, word of Karen's brazen inspection began to ripple quietly through the neighborhood by Sunday afternoon, carried on the subtle currents of back fence conversations and sidelong glances. Though no one said it outright, I could sense the shared relief that someone else had become her target, sparing them her scrutiny for the moment. But beneath that relief was a simmering resentment that had been building for years. People had tolerated her antics out of convenience and fear, but every ruler eventually pushes too far. And trespassing on a homeowner's property to poke at grass blades was the sort of overreach that couldn't be ignored. By Monday morning, her infamous yellow violation notices began appearing in mailboxes again, but this time they seemed almost desperate. She distributed new memos about hedge heights, porch decor, and lawn edging, as though tightening her grip on meaningless details could reverse the shift in power she didn't yet realize was underway. I watched her march from yard to yard, her shoulders stiff and her sunglasses hiding any flicker of unease. But even from a distance, I could tell she was unsettled. The trespass hadn't gone unnoticed, and she could feel the tide turning. Emily, ever methodical, began gathering the pieces. She pulled the HOA bylaws off the shelf, a heavy binder most of us had glanced through once and forgotten, and read every clause relevant to property boundaries, privacy, and enforcement procedures. Her legal mind sliced through the jargon with ease, and as she compared Karen's behavior against the very rules Karen wielded like a weapon, a picture of blatant hypocrisy emerged. It wasn't just the trespass. Karen had skipped required board approvals for her patio extension, neglected to file mandatory expense reports for landscaping projects, and authorized a contractor to trim community trees without the two-thirds vote the bylaws required. Emily highlighted each violation, her pen moving steadily, her expression calm but purposeful. She reminded me that bullies thrive on chaos and intimidation but crumble under the weight of facts. Every overreach Karen had committed was now a brick in the wall being built around her. Meanwhile, I noticed subtle shifts among our neighbors. Bob from 2 houses down waved more enthusiastically than usual and lingered by his mailbox, as if debating whether to say something. The Martins sent over a pie just because, their way of signaling solidarity without stepping into the crossfire. Even those who had once nodded obediently at Karen's dictates began to loosen their shoulders, testing the air like animals sensing a change in weather. Karen's authority was an illusion sustained by collective compliance, and cracks were forming in its foundation. I decided to bide my time, letting her dig deeper. Patience was critical. If I had stormed over to confront her immediately, she could have painted me as the unreasonable neighbor. Instead, I let her behavior speak for itself. Knowing every additional step she took onto the wrong side of the rules would strengthen our position. Over the next week, Karen doubled down, plastering the community bulletin board with exaggerated warnings about declining property values and issuing yet another memo citing uniformity concerns. But her tone was different now, sharper, less assured, tinged with the kind of defensiveness that betrays fear. I noticed her inspecting her own yard obsessively, as though aware that eyes were finally on her. She even repositioned her trash cans and repainted a small section of her fence, minor details she had long ignored but had chastised others for. The queen of compliance was quietly shoring up her own walls, and that subtle act spoke louder than any of her memos. Emily's research uncovered a little-known clause buried deep in the HOA's enforcement policy. Any complaint issued by the board had to be supported by 2 independent witnesses or a verified inspection conducted with prior notice. Karen's unannounced trespass, with no witnesses and no authorization, wasn't just improper. It rendered any complaint she filed against us invalid under the HOA's own framework. Armed with this knowledge, We began documenting everything with quiet precision. Emily photographed the exact footprints she'd left in the flower bed before the rain could erase them. I kept a log of her visits, including the date and time she crossed onto our property, and we discreetly confirmed with Bob that he'd seen her striding through our gate without permission. Each piece was small on its own, but together they formed a mosaic of misconduct. I could almost feel the balance shifting, like a seesaw tipping slowly but inevitably toward justice. I began to understand why Emily always said the law wasn't about loud voices, but about steady hands. Karen could shout about rules all she wanted, but we were the ones holding the facts. Why the following weekend, subtle murmurs of discontent had become quiet conversations. At the community playground, I overheard two neighbors whispering about how Karen had scolded them for hanging festive lights last Christmas, only for her to host an unapproved late-night bonfire 2 weeks later. Someone else mentioned how she'd used HOA funds to pay for decorative rocks that suspiciously matched the ones now lining her private garden. These weren't isolated gripes anymore. They were strands weaving into a larger narrative, one Karen could no longer control. Even those closest to her sensed it. Her usual entourage of loyalists, who often flanked her at meetings like a royal court, seemed to avoid her driveway. The empire she'd built on intimidation was starting to wobble, and she had no idea how fragile it had become. As Emily quietly compiled her legal notes, I felt a growing sense of inevitability. We didn't need to provoke Karen. She was doing that herself by overplaying her hand. All we had to do was wait for her to make one more arrogant move, the kind of misstep that would reveal the hollowness of her authority. I didn't know exactly what form it would take, but I was certain it was coming. And when it did, we'd be ready, not with anger or shouting, but with calm, undeniable evidence. The trap wasn't something we'd set. It was something she'd walked into willingly, blinded by her own arrogance. The neighborhood was watching. The ground beneath her was shifting. And Karen, still clutching her clipboard, hadn't yet realized that her reign was already beginning to crumble. The following days unfolded like the tightening of a coiled spring. Each new action from Karen adding more tension to an already fragile equilibrium. The weather had turned humid, the kind of thick air that makes even a still afternoon feel restless, and the mood in the neighborhood seemed to match it. Karen's memos grew increasingly shrill, with bolder fonts and underlined threats of fines for infractions so petty they bordered on parody. She issued a notice about unauthorized wind chimes and another about unapproved seasonal wreaths, as though controlling harmless details could reassert her slipping power. But beneath her paper offensive was a nervous energy she couldn't mask. She patrolled with exaggerated purpose, stopping at random lawns to bend over and pretend to inspect something while her sunglasses hid the darting glances of someone aware she was being observed. I watched her from the porch, coffee in hand, sensing that she was reaching for control she no longer possessed. Emily's strategy was as unhurried as it was thorough. She spent evenings at the kitchen table, the HOA binder open beside her laptop, comparing Karen's previous communications with the association's own rules. Her legal expertise gave her a clarity I lacked. She spotted inconsistencies and procedural failures that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. One clause she highlighted was particularly damning. Board members were strictly prohibited from using HOA resources or authority for personal benefit. The decorative rocks, the patio extension, the late-night parties, every one of them became an arrow in our quiver. Emily even pulled the county's property records and discovered that Karen had failed to submit the necessary forms for a drainage change she'd ordered 2 years prior. A clear violation that could have triggered county penalties if reported. Piece by piece, the image of Karen as the enforcer of community standards was unraveling into one of hypocrisy and recklessness. Meanwhile, small but significant shifts were happening among our neighbors. Bob, who had once avoided Karen's gaze, began spending more time in his yard, nodding to me in plain view whenever Karen passed by. The Martins invited several families over for lemonade on their porch, a subtle but deliberate act of community without Karen at its center. Even Karen's closest allies, the Petersons, who had once defended her every action, now seemed hesitant to engage. The whispers at the mailboxes turned into quiet solidarity, a shared recognition that her grip was weakening. It wasn't open rebellion yet, but it was enough to make Karen uneasy. She responded in the only way she knew, by escalating. She posted a public notice on the community bulletin board announcing an emergency HOA meeting to address ongoing violations threatening neighborhood integrity. Everyone understood it was about us, though no one dared to say so aloud. But this time, instead of dreading the confrontation, I felt a calm resolve. Emily assured me that the law was clear, and her careful preparation meant Karen's theatrics could no longer overshadow the facts. The day of the meeting arrived under a sky heavy with clouds, the kind that seemed to press closer to the earth before a storm. As I walked to the clubhouse with Emily at my side, I noticed the small but telling signs of shifting allegiance, neighbors offering encouraging nods, someone giving a discreet thumbs up, a quiet word of support whispered as we passed. Inside, the room buzzed with low voices and the smell of coffee, but there was a charged undercurrent, a sense that something significant was about to break. Karen stood at the front, impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer the color of storm clouds, her clipboard clutched like a shield. Her posture was as rigid as ever, but her movements betrayed tension, the smallest hesitation before she addressed the room. She launched into a speech heavy with dramatic warnings about property values and community standards, but the words felt hollow. The neighbors were no longer leaning in with reverence. They were exchanging sidelong glances, skeptical and impatient. Karen's power had always been performance, but her stage was collapsing beneath her. Emily sat quietly beside me, her expression unreadable but her presence radiating assurance. I could sense Karen trying to regain the old rhythm of dominance, pausing for effect, scanning the room for approving nods, but fewer people met her gaze. The Martins, usually deferential, stared fixedly at their hands. Even the Petersons avoided her eyes. When she unveiled photographs of our lawn, taken without permission, a ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Trespassing had been whispered about, but now the proof was on display. The act of parading stolen images, meant to shame us, instead underscored her intrusion. Emily's fingers rested lightly on her folder of notes, not as a threat, but as a quiet signal that the evidence was ready if needed. The room's energy shifted palpably. Karen could feel it too. Her voice grew sharper, her gestures more pointed, as if raising the volume could compensate for the loss of authority. Yet the more she spoke, the more the audience recoiled from her arrogance. When the meeting adjourned, neighbors filed out in subdued murmurs, but their eyes flicked between Karen and us, silently measuring the balance of power. Outside, the air was thick with the promise of rain, the clouds rolling in like a warning. Emily and I walked home without speaking, but the quiet between us wasn't anxiety, it was anticipation. Karen had overplayed her hand, and now she was vulnerable. She didn't know that Emily had already drafted a formal notice citing the trespass, the misuse of HOA resources, and the procedural breaches in her enforcement attempts. She didn't know that the bylaws she brandished so proudly were now a net closing around her. Most importantly, she didn't know that Emily had prepared to invoke state property laws that superseded HOA authority, a move that would not only invalidate Karen's violation notice, but expose her to potential legal consequences. The storm clouds above mirrored the one building within the neighborhood. Karen's reign was a house of cards, and the wind was about to blow. The storm broke the following morning with a downpour that seemed almost symbolic. Rain drumming on rooftops and rushing through gutters like nature itself was sweeping the slate clean. By the time the clouds cleared, the neighborhood felt strangely hushed, a collective holding of breath, as if everyone sensed the turning point approaching. Emily spent the early hours reviewing her neatly organized documents, copies of bylaws, photographs of Karen's trespass, county records revealing her unapproved patio extension, and the clause that explicitly prohibited board members from personal gain. Her preparation was meticulous, each page arranged like tiles in a mosaic that told a story Karen could not refute. The official HOA board meeting that night would be decisive. Emily didn't need theatrics or bravado. Her calm certainty was enough to make even my own nervous energy fade into quiet confidence. When evening fell and we walked to the clubhouse again, the sky had turned soft and gold, as though even the sunset was preparing for a shift in atmosphere. Neighbors trailed in behind us, their subdued chatter punctuated by glances toward Karen's house, where her SUV sat conspicuously absent of its usual aura of authority. The tension that had simmered for weeks had now condensed into a single moment of reckoning. Inside, the boardroom was bright but tense, the kind of room where the air feels charged even before anyone speaks. Karen stood at the front in a crisp white blouse and perfectly tailored slacks, her clipboard clasped tightly against her chest like a lifeline. She began with a speech about community pride and standards, but there was a tremor beneath the polished exterior, a hesitation that betrayed her awareness of the ground slipping away. As she spoke, Emily quietly slid her folder onto the table, its weight soft but undeniable. When the time came for questions from homeowners, the usual hesitant silence did not materialize. Instead, neighbors began to voice frustrations they had long buried, complaints about unfair fines, inconsistent enforcement, and the lingering resentment of her arbitrary decisions. The Martins, normally the epitome of politeness, mentioned the bird feeder incident. Bob spoke up about her unannounced inspections. Even the Petersons, once her loyal supporters, admitted they had grown uneasy with her heavy-handedness. Karen's eyes darted nervously as she tried to redirect blame, but the spell she had held over the community was gone. Then Emily, in her steady and deliberate way, outlined the facts without flourish. She explained the trespass, the lack of authorization for Karen's inspection, the requirement for witnesses and prior notice that had been ignored. She cited the clause barring board members from personal benefit, linking it to the decorative rocks and patio extension. She presented county records showing Karen's drainage violation and photographs documenting the unapproved changes to her property. Each point was delivered with precision, the kind of controlled momentum that makes even the boldest opponent realize they are cornered. The room was silent except for the rustle of paper and the soft hum of the air conditioner. Karen's confident posture sagged almost imperceptibly with each revelation, her once steely gaze now flickering with disbelief. The power she had wielded for so long was evaporating under the weight of her own hypocrisy. There was no dramatic shouting, no explosive confrontation, just the undeniable truth laid bare, and the quiet murmur of neighbors finally exhaling. The board members, clearly shaken, conferred briefly before announcing that Karen's violation notice against us was null and void, citing procedural misconduct and overreach. But they didn't stop there. Several homeowners moved to hold a vote of no confidence in her leadership, and the motion passed with a swiftness that surprised even me. In a single evening, Karen's reign as HOA president crumbled. Her clipboard, once a symbol of unchecked power, now looked like a relic of arrogance. She tried to protest, her voice cracking, but the neighbors who once feared her were no longer listening. The realization seemed to hit her all at once. She was no longer the enforcer but the violator, no longer the queen but just another neighbor with a long list of infractions to answer for. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood felt lighter, as if an oppressive humidity had finally lifted. People decorated their porches with colorful flowers again, hung wind chimes without second-guessing, and greeted each other without the shadow of Karen's oversight looming over every interaction. The Martins hosted a barbecue that drew nearly the entire street, laughter echoing across the yards in a way it hadn't for years. Bob finally installed the bird feeder he'd always wanted, this time with a mischievous grin. Karen remained in the neighborhood, but her presence had diminished. Without her title and her aura of authority, she walked past with her head lowered, her clipboard nowhere in sight. The SUV that had once been parked proudly by the hydrant was now meticulously placed within the rules. The decorative rocks disappeared from her yard, replaced by plain mulch. Even her once flamboyant parties fell silent. She wasn't ostracized, exactly. People were polite when they saw her, but the reverence was gone. Power, everyone realized, had always been an illusion sustained by fear, and fear had evaporated the moment someone stood up. For me and Emily, life returned to the peace we had always wanted. Our lawn remained as it had been, healthy and vibrant, a blend of native plants that attracted bees and butterflies, untouched by unwarranted criticism. On quiet evenings, we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set across the lake, the air filled with the sound of wind chimes and distant laughter. Every so often, I caught Emily's eye and we shared an unspoken understanding. Bullies thrive until someone calls their bluff, and Karen's bluff had been called. The experience had reminded the whole neighborhood of a simple truth. that strength isn't loudness or intimidation, but preparation, patience, and the courage to stand firm even when it's uncomfortable. In the end, Karen's trespass had been her undoing, a single arrogant step that revealed her hypocrisy and exposed the fragility of her throne. What she had intended as a show of dominance had instead become the catalyst for her downfall. And as the neighborhood flourished again under the warmth of genuine community, I couldn't help but feel grateful, not just for the dock, the lawn, or even the victory, but for the quiet lesson that power belongs only to those who respect it.